Nothing to see here, folks. Just move along. Good evening, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen. It is about 5:20 in the afternoon on a Thursday, the 23rd day of May 2024. It's sad that we look at something like this and find it humorous, though we should be in awe of whoever's mad fucking Photoshop skills put this together. Social commentary, YouTube. Don't delete me for this. Another one bites the dust. What are you gonna do? Hello, folks. How are you? Wasn't going to make a video today, but a couple of things have happened in the last 48 hours or so that I thought I would chat with you about. And it's not just going to be about Gaza. It's not just going to be about COVID-19, though they do factor in. Somebody sent me a nice card. Thank you very much. And in this card, they wrote this. This is a really crazy, stupid time period in human history, among other things. And it got me thinking. It got me thinking about teriology. It got me thinking about calling Gaza not a genocide when it's clearly a fucking genocide. It got me thinking about what I've called in the past critical thought theory, or the objectivity of truth. And I think that this is what people are sensing right now, is that we are living in an age in the Western world where certain forces are trying to remake history, trying to remake biology, trying to remake redefine things like genocide, words like genocide and democracy and elections and voting and physics. And I think in order to combat it, in order to be this, which is what my logo is, that is a biohazard warning. And the biohazard is critical thought. And we are considered a biohazard. There's a great quote from 1984. People talk about 2 + 2 = 5 all the time without really understanding what they're talking about. As Big Brother said to Winston, he said, you don't have to believe that 2 + 2 = 5. You just have to see that it's possible. I want you to understand something. Let me read that to you, start off with. In the end, the party would announce that 2 and 2 made 5, and you would have to believe it. It was inevitable that they should make the claim sooner or later. The logic of their position demanded it. Think about that in terms of where we are today. The logic of their position demanded it. Not merely the validity of experience, but the very existence of external reality was tacitly denied by their philosophy. The heresy of heresies was common sense. And what was terrifying was not that they would kill you for thinking otherwise, but that they might be right. For after all, how do we know that 2 and 2 makes 4, or that the force of gravity works, or that the past is unchangeable? If both the past and the external world only exist in the mind, and the mind itself is controllable, what then? Anything anything is possible. How do we find ourselves here? In 1984, the statement that 2 plus 2 equals 5 refers to the manipulation of truth. Winston himself insists on the objectivity of truth, represented by the contrasting statement 2 plus 2 equals 4. Orwell's meaning, however, is that truth itself can be manipulated and undermined by the state. Truth itself. So how do we find ourselves here? How do we find ourselves where Joe Rogan goes on fucking his show for 3 hours and gives this moron a platform from which to preach his Terryology? This is Terrence Howard's writing. He believes that the theory 1 times 1 equals 1 must be rewritten as 1 times 1 equals 2. Taking the foundation of our understanding of math and science and logic and turning it on his head. If 1 times 1 equals 2, then 1 times 2 equals 3, and 1 times 3 equals 4, and 1 times 4 equals 5. To infinity and beyond. That's a quote from a cartoon. To infinity and beyond. He is a fraud. He is a huckster. He is a failed actor who had a chance, who had a career, but he thought he was more valuable than he actually was. And so he missed out on some key fucking roles and developed a reputation for being a real fucking egotistical asshole. So rather than saying, oh, well, I screwed that up and finding another job or another career, he decided to become a guru. He decided to become a genius and to mesmerize people with the power of his intellect. He decided to try to become L. Ron Hubbard. He created something called Terryology. L. Ron Hubbard created Scientology. Someone named Charlie, or Penguins Zero, who, by the way, happens to be down here in Tampa, probably not far from me, except in terms of economic prosperity in the neighborhoods and he hangs out with and lives in, compared to those that I hang out in and live in. Aside from that, we in that regard we live galaxies apart. However, he talked about this, and it was one of the reasons I decided to make this video. But then he went on to spend 15 minutes in a video showing with props that 1 times 1 does actually equal 1. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to insult my audience in that way. And Charlie probably shouldn't have done that either. 1 times 1 equals 1. 2 plus 2 equals 4. Critical thought theory, or the objectivity of truth. This is what we're going to talk about today, briefly, because I know at some point Aunt Bibi is about to call, and when she does, the heresy of heresies was common sense. And that, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, is what we deal with on my website all the time. Heresy. So let's talk about it. I'm going to share with you what I believe to be the foundation of this cathedral of lies that they are building. And I believe, once again, it is now probably more important than ever that we address it and we come to terms with it, and we come to understand it. There's been a number of examples of situations recently. When I say recently, I say the last 20 years, where we have been, as a people, as a civilization, as a culture, a Western civilization, westernized civilization, the culture that is America, to accept what most people would seem to think at first glance and second glance and third glance to be violations of common sense. In spite of the evidence before us, there are a number of people, a good percentage of people, maybe not as high as the mainstream media would have you believe, but still higher than we would like, who buy into these campaigns. And that is exactly what they are. They are campaigns. Campaigns to dismantle the objectivity of truth, the objectivity of reality that we live in. And I'm sure me saying this, you probably have 4 or 5 good examples pop into your head, but I'm going to read a couple of them for you. While thinking about this, I listed a bunch of them. Obviously, the assault on the iconic characters of our literary history, of our film history, of our art history, of our iconic characters from video games, from mythology, from classic literature, all of these things, tearing down these iconic figures for whatever the justification is. I guess to make them more palatable for modern audiences, this whole woke trend that we're talking about here, making them for taking out the patriarchy or the image of the patriarch. You understand what I'm saying. Cultural history is important for the definition of the identities of the people of a fucking civilization. That's a fact. Destroying them, tearing them down, like, say, statues of historical figures for 2 years, 3 years. That's something that our special operations teams do in other countries because we want to erase their sense of national history, of national pride. That's what they want to do. And that's what we do. That's why we do it over there, and that's why it was done to us here. Erasing our history. Tearing down statues of Abraham Lincoln because of racism is remarkable. Nobody would look at that and said that makes any common sense, and yet it was done, and it was applauded by the fucking media and by politicians. I'm not going to go into all of these examples, but I will talk about them. The assault on our historic values, the assault on our Constitution. Let's get more specific. Black box voting. Subprime mortgage crisis. TARP bailouts. QE1, QE2, QE3, QE infinity. Russiagate. Lies to get us to go to war in Iraq. Lies to get us to go to war in Afghanistan. COVID-19. Being told don't do research. Hate those that do. And literally that ignorance is your strength. The push for global reformation and global governance due to global warming scare. Flight MH370, the first time ever a commercial airliner just disappeared and was never found again. When everyone knows it blew up over the fucking South China Sea because we were running cruise missile tests and drills. We had 2 cruise missile destroyers, and they accidentally hit that fucking plane and destroyed it. But we couldn't do that because of Obama's pivot to Asia. We would lose revenue. And so, this whole fucking bullshit story dragged on for weeks and weeks, and they ended up pushing that fucking story to an area off the coast of Australia where certain oil companies that were well positioned with our fucking political class wanted to search the bottom of the ocean to see if there was oil down there for them to fucking drill. And that's where we searched. And the taxpayers paid for it under the guise they were looking for MH370. And nobody said a fucking word, regardless of how much that story violated our understanding of common sense. The insurrection of 1/6. Watching these people walking through the fucking things, holding their cameras up, looking out, and that was an insurrection, and people were screaming, and fucking OAC talked about this bullshit story about her hiding and all this. The insurrection of 1/6. The list keeps going. The fact that the NFL and the NBA both have partnered now with online gambling houses, and we're supposed to believe after we see all these fucking calls or all these non-calls or all this bullshit and obvious interference via the referees on both the NFL and the NBA that they're not rigged. Of course they're rigged. They're in partnership with the gambling houses. Of course they're fucking rigged. They were rigged before because they knew certain teams, NFL, NBA, would get higher ratings through the playoffs if they stayed in the playoffs. We knew that. The year after Katrina, guess who won the fucking Super Bowl? What a coincidence. The year Tom Brady came down to Tampa, guess who won the Super Bowl? It was held in Tampa. What a coincidence. No, it isn't. Men can get pregnant. Torture is okay. The war on terror, the peak oil crisis, which they said was starting in the late 1970s, and every year they come out and tell us it's peak oil, it's peak oil. The obvious genocide in Gaza, the American Gladiator camp operations, and of course, the Black Lives Matter destabilization campaign. These are all examples in the last 20 years of events that took place where we were told what we are seeing with our eyes. Who are you going to believe? Me or your lying eyes told us, where we were told this bullshit by our fucking glorious leaders, by those who serve the masters of the universe. And you better shut the fuck up. You better not talk about these things, or your videos will get strikes, or your channel will be taken down if you get too many strikes. Censorship is freedom. This is what we were told. This is where we are. And just like the individual who sent me this, it is a scary and stupid time in American life, and it really is. But I think there is a genesis, there is a starting point for this. Now, before this starting point that I'm going to talk to you about, before this starting point, there were similar types of events, similar types of stories. This is not to say that we're not talking about people lying to us. We're not talking about people deceiving us. We are talking about people telling us that your perception of reality, all of the things I just read to you, deal with that. Your perception of reality is wrong. We're not talking about just lies. But there are events where we were told, like, say, JFK's assassination. JFK's assassination, where we can clearly see and know, and if you listen to the fucking recordings on the motorcycles, there were many more shots than 3. Clearly, if you look at the report and the vehicle, the damage done to the fucking limousine, clearly more shots were fired than 3. All of this is evidence. All of this is fact. We are now supposed to believe that there's only 3 shots. This is an example. I'll read a couple to you. Let me read a couple to you. Reagan shooting just happened to be the son of a longtime partner and friend of the vice president 60 days into the first term in office of Ronald Reagan, whose vice president ran against him and wanted so badly to be president, George Herbert Walker Bush. A guy, by the way, who was there when JFK was shot. A guy, by the way, who for 20 years lied and said he had no idea where he was that day, when every American knows where they were that day in November. RFK's shooting, MLK's shooting, the Iranian hostage crisis, trickle-down economics, Waco, moon landings, Cuban Missile Crisis, destruction and dismemberment of Yugoslavia, the domino theory of suppressing evil communism throughout Asia, and of course, Central America, South America. These are examples of lies that we were told, of campaigns of disinformation we were given, but nothing like actual assaults on our understanding, on our core understanding of how this country works, how the world works, how physics works, how math works. And what is at the core of that program? Well, it's very simple. You'll probably already figure out where I am going with this. This is a report put together by the RG Lee Group, and it was prepared for Deutsche Bank. And I will give you the basic rundown. It is called Damage Assessment for 130 Liberty Street Property, World Trade Center Dust Signature, Composition, and Morphology. In this paper, which is hard to find, Scribed has it behind a paywall. I found it at 9/11 Research, World Trade Center 7.net. They downloaded it, just like I did, a long time ago on my website before they deleted it, before WordPress deleted my website. And so luckily, they still have it up. But it's very difficult to find. And why is that? That's because what this report basically does, Deutsche Bank, all the windows were blown out on their side. It's called overblast in a controlled demolition. When there's overblast in a controlled demolition, it blows out the windows, it damages buildings beside the building they are taking down. That's why controlled demolition experts like Controlled Demolition Inc., who, by the way, were on site when 9/11 happened and the buildings came down. They hire what's called special engineers, and the special engineer firm comes in and they put these cameras, specialized cameras, and they focus these cameras on the buildings next to the building they are demolishing, so that they can record exactly how much structural stress is put on those buildings. with or without windows being blown out from overblast. They, by the way, had with them on September 11th, 2001, the engineering firm that they call a special engineering firm. And they were there with them on the day these things came down. So Deutsche Bank had a building at 130 Liberty Street, which faced the World Trade Centers. And after it was all over and done with, all the windows on that side of the building were blown out, along with a number of other buildings from the overblast. So what did they do? They had all of this dust from the demolition in their fucking offices now. And they had to pay for the windows, and they had to pay to clean the fucking dust up. And of course the dust was dangerous, so there was hazardous. So there's considerable expense. They went after the insurance company that was insuring World Trade Centers at the time. The insurance companies, because they're all about business, they said, we're not paying for that. You got to pay for that yourself. Your insurance company is going to pay for that. And there was a legal battle. So in order to prove, because they said their argument was, you can't prove all that dust came from our building that's piled up on top of your papers and your desks with your blown out windows. You can't prove it wasn't there before the buildings came down. Prove it. So they did. Let me just give you a really quick summation of what I just said. Greedy business interests, greedy corporate business interests provided for us. There's plenty of evidence that 9/11 was an inside job. There's plenty. We can go through all the work of David Ray Griffith, if you like. We can go through all the work of architects and engineers from 9/11 Truth, if you like. We can go through all the work that I've done, if you like. There's plenty of evidence. The best evidence came from two corporations squabbling over a small fucking fee. And when Deutsche Bank decided, okay, fuck you, we'll prove it. I'll have the RG Lee Group do an analysis of the exact fingerprint of the dust that's down there at ground zero and the dust that's in some of my desk on the 34th floor, and we will prove it came from, and they did. And of course, obviously, the insurance company had to pay. But because of the greed of corporate America, we now have what is, I believe, the best evidence 9/11 was controlled demolition. And if 9/11 is a controlled demolition, and if the properties of physics and the laws of physics did not just all of a sudden fail for one fucking day, like we are told to believe, we have to suspend our disbelief because we're good little audience members, good little citizens. If it was a controlled demolition, it was not angry Muslims. It was not Osama bin Laden. It was the people that wrote Rebuilding America's Defenses, the project for the new American century, who called for a new Pearl Harbor type event exactly 365 days before September 11th, 2001. They needed a new Pearl Harbor type event to facilitate a super fast refinancing, restructure, Patriot Act of America's defenses, both physical defenses and intelligence defenses, in order to assert their dominance, our dominance, over the entire fucking globe. a dominance to last 1,000 years, as they put it themselves. That's what they did. And this report proves it beyond a shadow of a doubt. That's why when it came out, what was it, December 2023? Yes, it was, 2003. December 2003. That's why when it came out in December 2003, all of a sudden, this guy named Stephen Jones was tasked with distracting the truth movement with his nanothermite bullshit. Talking about the iron-rich spheres. They were iron, but they were also asbestos, barium, beryllium, cadmium, chromium, copper, lead, manganese, nickel, mercury, dust, PCB, PNA, quartz, dioxin, zinc, and other things. And other things. Not just iron-rich spheres, which meant it was thermite. No. They were lots of components. Why is that? One reason is because all the structural steel that was missing from the Trade Center's ground zero, when it was all done and the quote-unquote dust settled, all of the 40,000 plus trusses, some of which were 66 feet long, all of them were gone. The floor pans, which the light concrete that made up the floors, 110 on each floor, 110 floors on each building, the floor pans were gone. They were gone. Compression doesn't do that. There is no world in which the compression of those massive trusses, 40-something thousand trusses, would evaporate them, would turn them into microspheres. There is no logic to any of that. So, what could possibly do it? Well, according to this report, they said that what was witnessed and the evidence, their evidence shows, was not that of a compression event of floors pancaking down, the crush down, crush up theory. Instead, what they said it was a combustion event. This is an extremely important piece of physical evidence, scientific evidence. And they said, it's those fucking microspheres that are in the dust that form the fingerprints of the 9/11 fucking dust, the ground zero dust. And it was that, the basis on that, which proved that what happened that day with their windows at Deutsche Bank was caused by what happened at the World Trade Centers. They said in the statement that they made that what created the dust and the unique fingerprint of that dust was not a compression event. It was a combustion event. And the idea is this. The many different metals and minerals and things that were found in the microspheres were the same metals and material that's made up in the structural steel of the trusses and the floor pans and other pieces of metal and like metal doors or metal desks and things like that. But the vast majority of it was all the missing fucking trusses and all the missing fucking floor pans. Now the question is, how were they evaporated? And the answer is simple. It was a combustion event. When PETN is detonated, it creates a blast wave. It is a high explosive. Thermite is a low explosive. It just burns. Like gunpowder. Under pressure, gunpowder can force, when it burns quickly, it can create a force, but it is nothing like high explosives. You don't make bullets out of high explosives. They would blow up in your face. PETN is a high explosive. It is commonly used in controlled demolition. It's called det cord. It is an entire fucking tube that looks like, I don't know, like fiber optic cable. It is a tube of high explosive. They can use it. They use it for breaching doors and things in the military and I guess in the police nowadays. They use it to cut down trees in some areas. They will wrap a couple wraps of this stuff around the tree, stand back, detonate it, boom, and it'll fucking cut a tree. It's used for all kinds of things, but mainly it's used in controlled demolition. Why? Because the key word in controlled demolition is control. If you burn PETN, like, remember the underwear bomber coming into Detroit at Christmas during the Obama days, and he set fire to his diaper of doom, and it burned? That was PETN. However, if you ignite it with, say, blasting cap or whatever you use, detonator, it explodes. And it creates a shock wave over 3,000 meters per second. That is what defines it as a high explosive. To be specific, PETN per weight is 1.5 times or 1.4 times stronger than TNT, than dynamite. But here's the thing about PETN. When it detonates, it creates not only a shock wave, but a heat wave. It creates a massive fucking heat surge that registers over 8,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Over 8,000 degrees. To put that into perspective, a blast furnace for the industrial quick melting of fucking structural steel, all kinds of steel, burns at about 4,350 degrees Fahrenheit. To put it into a little more perspective for you, 8,100 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly, what PETN burns at, is very close to the temperature of the surface of the sun. PETN burns very hot, and they used a lot of PETN on September 11th, 2001. So much so that they evaporated people, desks, chairs, drywall, televisions, glass, windows, but mainly 40-something thousand massive steel, structural steel trusses that were 4 feet tall and 60-some feet wide along. Some were 30-some feet long, some were 60-some feet long. They were evaporated instantly. How does that work? Why are we talking about microspheres and not little pancakes? Something is flash melted, sitting on an oven. Let's say you can all of a sudden turn something up to 8,000 degrees, and that structural steel you have sitting on that plate that heats up that much will just evaporate down. It will turn into a running river of steel, like was seen in some places in 9/11, and certainly after on Ground Zero, as they were pulling out burning metal that was still fucking molten. That's not going to get you microspheres. That's not going to get you 100,000 tons of microspheres. So how do you get the spheres? You get the spheres. This is why the RG Lee group said it was a combustion event. Combustion. What happens in combustion is this wave of fucking 8,000 degree plus heat moving at 3,000 meters per second. Evaporates everything. But when it evaporates, it sends it off into space. It hangs in the air for a second. And the outside of it, not the inside, but the outside of it, cools. But because it is suspended, and because of physics, even though we're not supposed to talk about physics anymore, because of physics, because it's suspended in the air evenly all the way around, the metal pulls itself into a sphere. Not into a flat pancake, because it's been combusted down, because it still cools in the air in those big clouds of gray fucking smoke and dust and ash that we saw. They sphere. They turn into a sphere. There is no other explanation on 9/11. There's no other explanation for why metal and steel buildings fell down because of fucking office fires. Let's just put that out there. None. And even NIST admitted that the vast majority of the jet fuel, which only burns at 1,400 fucking degrees Fahrenheit, structural steel needs to be heated to 2,750 degrees Fahrenheit to melt, to start to melt. But jet fuel only burns at 1,425 degrees Fahrenheit, whatever it is. That was all ejected out the fucking windows. And how did they know that? How did NIST come to that conclusion? They looked at the goddamn videos. Those big orange balls of fire. That wasn't paper, boys and girls. That wasn't reports by somebody on their desk. That wasn't a fucking notebook. That was all the shit that we were told caused the collapse of the World Trade Centers. It was the first time in history. The first time in history. And the last time in history. And now we're 22 years, 23, going on 23 years afterwards. The last time in history that ever happened. That a skyscraper, steel and concrete skyscraper, collapsed into its own footprint due to office fires. But that's not what happened. And the evidence proves it. There's all kinds of evidence. The best evidence that exists is this. And I'll post a link to it down below. Why is this important? I believe this is important because once they got away with this, once they got away with telling us, it was so obvious. One of the news, damn Brokaw or one of these guys was watching this fucking thing happening. And he goes, looking at these buildings collapse into their own footprint at free fall acceleration, which is impossible without controlled demolition. He looked at it and goes, it kind of looks like when they bring down those buildings in a controlled demolition. Of course, then he went quiet for a couple of minutes, had a talking to, I'm sure, by somebody, and then he came back and was like, oh, yeah, terrorism. They were able to silence the 9/11 truthers, the conspiracy theorists, in the mainstream media, in the alternative media. They were able to shut us up, like they were able to shut us up when we talk about things like black box voting, like they're able to shut us up when it comes to talking about things like COVID vaccines, mRNA, quote-unquote, experimental gene therapy jabs. like they're trying to shut us up when we're talking about things like genocide being committed in Gaza by glorious Israel. Shut up. What are you going to believe? Me or your fucking lying eyes? We're told. Repeatedly told. And where does it come from? Where does it come from? Their feeling that they can do these things to us. The economic collapse that took place in 2008 was done on purpose. They started it in 1999 when someone tried their best to warn Congress that these derivatives were weapons of economic mass destruction, Brooksley born. They screeched at her. They yelled at her because they had a fucking plan. And in 2002, they came out with the American Dream Act to use government money to give people who couldn't be qualified for these fucking houses enough money to get a down payment so they could put them in these fucking houses, tell them to fill out these liar loans, and then a couple years later, take all the fucking houses back and create the biggest fucking economic collapse in history. They did it on fucking purpose. And people like us talking about that, we were conspiracy theorists, we're Luddites. How dare you? You don't understand fucking economics. How dare you say what's obvious? It's the heresy of heresies is common sense. And today, for those of us out here, those of you out here, looking at what's happening in Gaza and trying to understand why the fuck people can't figure out it's obviously genocide. They obviously are trying to steal the land. It's fucking, they've killed 15,000 plus children. And somehow we're being told that Israel is the fucking victim? What is wrong with you? Why can't you understand that? That's what's wrong with them. That's why they can't understand that. And the best way to fix this problem is to go back. It's like this, boys and girls. It's like this. It's like understanding what accountability means. I'm going to give somebody credit for helping put me on fucking this path to make this video. And his name is Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu was throwing a tirade. Oh my God, how dare you fucking charge us with genocide when he's clearly committing genocide? How dare you? How dare you issue arrest warrants against me, against us, me and Hamas? You might as well go back to 9/11 and issue arrest warrants for Osama bin Laden and George W. Bush, is what he fucking said. And you know what? He's fucking right. And he knows he's right. He knows he's right. He knows what he's saying is fucking right. He's telling people who know, listen, motherfuckers, you can't arrest me because I know what happened on September 11th. And George W. Bush is still alive. That's what he's saying. That's the truth. People like Kyle Kalinske and all these fuckers, nice dyed hair and shit, and oh, he looks good, ooh, Manscaped. Fuck him. They're like, oh my God, he's going crazy. He's saying this wacky, crazy shit. He's not saying wacky, crazy shit. He's telling the truth. You're going to go after Bibi Netanyahu because no one's buying our bullshit. No one's buying 2 + 2 = 5 when it comes to us, but you're going to believe 2 + 2 = 5 when it comes to 9/11? Fuck you. I'll tell the truth. He knows. He damn sure knows. That's what that meant, Kyle Kalinske. People who haven't figured that out yet. And the reason you haven't figured that out yet is because you haven't figured out what happened on September 11th. And that's the core problem. And that's why people fall for shit like teriology. 1 × 1 can = 2. Fuck you. Get a real job. Stop trying to be L. Ron Hubbard. You dumb fuck. That's all Joe Rogan should have said to him. The door is right there. But instead, because the important thing is, there has to be an objectivity of truth. It's not important that you think that 2 plus 2 equals 5. It is important that you think 2 plus 2 can equal 5. It is important that you think that it's possible Israel's not committing genocide in Gaza, and it's important that you think that steel and concrete buildings can collapse in their own fucking footprint at free fall acceleration due to office fires. It's important that you think that could happen. It's important that you think COVID-19 could have come from a pangolin or bat soup rather than the Defense Department and the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. I'm saying to you, Kyle Kalinskis of the fucking world, the Charlie Penguin Zeros of the fucking world, to everybody else, you do a disservice. You do a disservice when you try to explain how 1 times 1 works to your audience. But you also do a disservice when you ignore the foundation upon which all of this bullshit is built. And that is 9/11. We have said in the 9/11 truth movement for decades, plural decades, that if this isn't fucking exposed, if there is no accountability for this, God knows what they will do next. And that's what they did next. That's what they did next. That's what they did next. And it's not going to stop here. There's a guy in China. Some kind of government official, just recently arrested for some small fucking bribe from some fucking business that he thought he could get away with. No. For whatever fucking, it doesn't matter in China. It can be 50 goddamn yen. It doesn't fucking matter in China. You do some corruption, you get caught, they're going to arrest you, they are going to prosecute you, they are going to shame you, they are going to put you in jail for 5, 10, 15 years, depending. But you're going to lose your fucking house, you're going to lose your fucking savings, your family's going to go out on the goddamn street, and they don't give a fuck. They don't give a fuck. Ain't no fucking TikTok thing saying, oh my God, they're so mean to this fucking family. That isn't fucking run and owned and operated by the CIA or the fucking, what is it, NED. They don't give a fuck. They don't tolerate corruption. They don't tolerate it. It sends a powerful message. That's why it doesn't happen very often. It doesn't happen very often. Because they know the consequences. Bibi Netanyahu, what's he saying? No one's believing my 2 plus 2 equals 5 fucking shit, so I'm going to fucking, you better be careful. You better be careful. Because I can stop that 2 plus 2 equals 5 shit that came from September 11th, 2001. That's what his message was. That's what he was saying. Good. Let's do it. I'm 100% on board with Bibi Netanyahu with that. 100%. It is time that we stopped accepting the fact that our system is corrupt. There was one last thing. Again, on Joe Rogan's show, he had this guy named Dave Smith, this jackass libertarian slash neoliberal free marketeer. And he's talking about corruption. He says, oh, the progressives and Bernie Sanders, that's their big thing. Talking about getting corporate money out of Washington. But he goes, and Joe was like, yeah, it's a good idea. He's like, well, yeah, it's a good idea on the surface. But then, you know, they're going to find a way. They're going to be able to find a way. Don't find a way in China, do they, motherfucker? Consequently, Moderna and the Defense Threat Reduction Agency and Anthony Fauci, they didn't have fucking jabs to give all the Chinese. They only opened up the ability for those things years later because businessmen had to have a fucking Pfizer jab to get into the United States. That was the only thing. They didn't let that poison into their country. They actually have an FDA-like fucking regulatory agency that looks out for the interests of the fucking Chinese people. We don't. But you start that process of accountability. You start the process of accountability and you start teaching people how to think laterally, how to use common sense, how to listen to that little voice in the back of their mind that says, you know what, this black box voting shit, it would be really easy for them to steal elections like this, wouldn't it? Listen to that voice. Listen to that common sense. That's where it started. That's where it started. Sure, there was shit that happened before. But these were lies. They weren't assaults on your fucking understanding of the world of physics, of biology. Global warming. That's what's happening here. And all of that started with September 11th, 2001. So, all of this aside, I will continue to post my stuff, my writing, my research, and my work on 9/11, and I will continue to start talking more about September 11th because it is vital. And I'm sure people will be like, oh, Scott, now you understand why I'm doing it. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm talking to you. That's why I'm saying all this. Okay? Okay. It's Thursday. I hope you have a good day. Again, I'll post a link to this down below so you can go read it yourself. In this, they literally say what happened on September 11th was not a compression event, as in crush down, crush up, which is the stupidest bullshit ever. They say it was a combustion event. High explosive combustion, i.e. controlled demolition. It is important that we remember that common sense is extremely valuable, even in modern life. And we don't let them strip us of it. When something looks wrong and feels wrong and smells wrong, it's wrong. Thank you for your time.